And good afternoon. It's Monday, 1 o'clock. Welcome to Deal Doctor Live. And we're going to talk today a little bit about possession after closing. As many of you know, there are a lot of conversations and misunderstandings, miscommunications, disagreements. So let's start with what possession after close is. It is that period of time that the buyers and sellers agree that the seller is going to remain in the home after the closing actually occurs. Now, one of the options obviously is to transfer keys immediately at the closing table and the buyer gets possession immediately. That's the easiest and frankly the best option. However, in most cases, the seller's going to want to have some time to move their belongings out and so on. Let's talk about the language. And I urge you again, as I do often, to read your purchase agreements carefully as it regards this particular topic, because every one is going to be a little different. I'm going to use the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement as an example today, but I'm also going to refer to a couple of others that are available, forms that are available for you and your buyers and sellers to use to protect themselves. But in paragraph 22 of the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, it says that the possession to be delivered to the buyer subject to the rights of present tenants, if any. So what happens if there's a tenant who's living in the property and won't get out and you close? What's the remedy? Whether it's immediate possession or it's 10 days down the road or 30 days down the road, if that tenant won't get out, then somebody's going to have to start the eviction process. If that tenant, for example, claims to have been exposed to COVID or have COVID symptoms, it may delay the process of them becoming evicted. So there's a lot to take into consideration when you're talking about selling a property that has tenants in it. Most often, a seller is not going to want to evict their tenant until a closing, and then it's not their right to do it anyway. But if they evict a tenant prior to closing and the tenant moves out, and then the buyer for some reason doesn't close, well, all of a sudden that seller has a piece of property that's not generating any income. So usually a seller will not agree to get rid of a tenant before the closing, and then it's the responsibility of the buyer to go through the eviction process, provided there is no lease in place. If there's a lease in place, then obviously the tenant has the right to live out that lease. So be aware when you are getting involved in properties that have tenants in them. Be very aware of what the consequences are for doing that. But that's not the focus of what we want to talk with you about today. In the various purchase agreements, the language is slightly different. The tenancy, the occupancy fee, for example, if somebody's going to pay, let's say, 1/30th of the new monthly payment, for example, in an occupancy fee for a period of 7, 10, 30 days, whatever it might happen to be, that is different than tenancy and sufferance. Tenancy and sufferance is what happens after the period that they have agreed upon. The buyers and the sellers, both parties, have agreed to give the seller a period to possess the property beyond the closing, but up until a certain point. After that point, they become a tenant in sufferance, which is that they no longer belong there, they have no right being there, and now they are beginning to incur damages against the buyer, which the buyer can then take them to court and sue them for. And you can actually stipulate in the purchase agreement what that tenancy and sufferance period will be. Now, a question comes up a lot. When do the keys get exchanged? Well, that's a good question. If you read the purchase agreement closely, in this particular case, the keys are exchanged. It says at the very end of paragraph 22 that the seller will deliver the property free of trash and debris and in broom clean condition, whatever that is, shall remove all personal property unless otherwise stated or in an additional agreement, shall make arrangements for final payment on utilities, and shall deliver all keys to buyer. It doesn't say anywhere in there that they don't deliver some keys to buyer. In fact, when the closing occurs, the buyer is now the new owner of the property. And just like any other landlord, the buyer has a right under emergencies to have access to the property or within due notice to deal with something that may need to happen for the property. For example, the seller who has, let's say, 30 days possession goes away for a weekend and a flooding event occurs, a main break of some water main break, or a house catches fire, or there's been vandalism or something like that. That new buyer actually has the right to access that property under those conditions. But if they don't have the keys to the property, they can't do that. So it's not abnormal that sellers will give a set of keys to the buyer under the understanding that they must act according to the Michigan Landlord-Tenant Act. So, for example, what does that mean? I'll try to read it. It's small print. Hang on. It says, the landlord can't enter your home without permission except in an emergency. If there's a problem that your landlord needs to enter your home to fix, you should be given reasonable notice, reasonable time before the landlord plans to enter. So, for example, if there has to be a new gas meter put in, and the new buyer has to access the property in order to do that, they can call the tenant, the seller, and say, hey, this is going to be coming in tomorrow. It's going to be installed tomorrow. Will 1 o'clock work? Hopefully that all works out. But they do have a right under Michigan law to have the access to the property for the purposes of emergencies or to maintain the property in its present condition. So now let's pretend that you want to avoid having arguments and disagreements. You can actually create language, which I did this morning, which you can put in your purchase agreement in order to clarify. And it says, seller agrees to provide a set of keys to property at closing. Buyer acknowledges the buyer must abide by Michigan landlord-tenant laws regarding access to the property during the seller's possession after closing. What I just read to you. So, in other words, yeah, we're going to give you keys, but don't think you can just knock on the door and come walking in. You have to give us reasonable notice if there's something that needs to be fixed in the property. If you have to get an estimate for a roof leak that started, the other day sometime after closing. If the furnace goes out during the time of possession, and the buyer has to get in the property to get a furnace person to estimate or to fix. All of those reasons are reasons that the buyer deserves to have a set of keys. But they also have to give reasonable notice to the seller slash now tenant before they can do that. Now, there's also a little thing called the walkthrough. A lot of people talk about doing a walkthrough, and I see on a lot of purchase agreements that this offer is subject to a walkthrough within 24 hours prior to closing. Okay, but there's no consequences, first of all, in most of them. That's all it says. This offer is subject to a walkthrough. Okay, well, have a nice walk, enjoy your walk, but it doesn't have any consequences. Now, if it were to say, buyer has a right to walk through the property within 24 hours of closing, and if they find anything that is wrong with the property, they have the right to terminate. Think about that for a moment. In this market, would that scare a seller away from accepting your offer? Probably, just as setting up an escrow would. For example, if the addendum were to say this offer is subject to the seller setting aside $2,000 in an escrow fund to secure that the property is going to be in like condition to its present state as of delivery of possession to the buyer, just as an example. Again, in this market, that offer will probably go to the bottom of the pile, if there's a pile. Now, if there's not a pile, the seller might actually entertain that offer, and you might be able to set up some sort of an escrow account to make sure that the property is free of trash and debris and is in broom clean condition. That's about as subjective as it gets, but for all intents and purposes, it can be widely interpreted, but generally it means pretty cleaned up, not a complete mess. They have to make arrangements for the final payment on utilities and shall deliver all keys to buyer. At that moment, all of the keys, at the moment of their giving up of possession, the time they give up possession to the buyer, the seller has to give all the keys to the buyer at that point. So there are little fine lines. They're very, you have to pick up on the clues to say, this is about delivering all of the keys to the buyer, not just a set of keys for the purposes of an emergency. Now, I'll tell you that right now, I would guess that probably 60% or more, maybe 75% of sellers don't give up their keys until they deliver possession. And in virtually all of those cases, very rarely is there any problem. But I'm talking about it from a legal standpoint and from a tenant-landlord standpoint, that buyer actually does have a right to keys at the closing, as of the closing, because they become a landlord as the seller becomes a tenant. So I hope that's clear. Let's say that you wanted to do something really interesting. We actually have a number of forms in dotloop right now. And the one I'm going to refer to first of all is the Greater Kalamazoo Association of Realtors Addendum to the Authorized Buy and Sell Agreement. And this has to do with possession prior to close. It actually goes through an agreement which explains at the very top that the buyer is to have possession prior to close. 1, this issue is extremely risky for both buyer and seller. Concerns for the seller include the property may be damaged by the tenant buyer and the sale doesn't close. Number 2, the buyer may discover defects and refuse to close. 3, the buyer may be unable to obtain funds but refuse to vacate, so you have to go through eviction. liability to the seller if the buyer or someone else is injured on the property. The buyer may cause liens to be placed on the property, like, having a roof fixed or electrical repairs could cause a mechanic's lien to be put on the property. And if they never close, then it's the seller's responsibility to clear those liens. Concerns for the buyer is the buyer may invest money and or effort only to discover the seller refuses to close or cannot deliver a clear title. So they go in and they paint and they wallpaper or whatever they do, and all of a sudden there's not a clear title. And they've invested a couple of grand before the closing. Now what? Some financing may not be available if it could be construed to be a refinance rather than a purchase. So this is a form that is from GCAR, and it is regarding possession prior to close, which is something as a listing agent I would never do. Never. Okay. Never. Then there's a rental agreement. This, I think, somebody pulled this off a Google search. It's just very general, and it says, here are the responsibilities, here's the terms, what we're going to pay per month, late charge, utilities, pets, occupants, all of those sort of things. This is a rental agreement, and you can make your purchase agreement subject to both parties coming to terms on a rental agreement. That helps to protect your buyer and make sure that they get the property in like condition as to when they bought it. This is possession addendum to the buy and sell agreement. Again, covers many of the same things that are covered in the purchase agreement. So I encourage you to look those over. That rental agreement actually was a few pages long. I just noticed that. So, but it covers a whole bunch, and that's in .loop. So you can go in and find it in .loop, in templates. This is the Michigan Realtors version. And there is a West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement version. All of them are essentially temporary occupancies, leases, whatever you want to call them, to establish what the parameters are, what the expectations are between the seller and the buyer as far as possession after close. We get a lot of questions on that issue, and so the way that I interpret this is that if there's going to be possession after close, that possession will be given up at, let's say, 8 p.m. on the day 30 days after completion of the sale. Well, 30 days after means that you start counting the day after the completion of the sale. So the first full day is the day after closing, which is another question that we get a lot of. They assume that the buyer has possession that day, or you start counting on the day of closing. And according to the contract, that's not the way it is. Now, if you want it to be that way, if both parties agree to it, make sure it's clear and clarified in the contract that the first day of buyer's possession will be the day of closing, and 30 days from that, counting from that point. Any questions? Do we have any questions out there so far?
There is one. I don't know how to say her last name. Karen CCUK. So,
Where is it?
the question.
Yeah, I'm not. Hang on.
It It's not coming up on my stream, but it's on. I have your stream up on my phone. I can see it. But she asks, Don, can you put your lingo regarding the seller becoming a tenant and buyer receiving keys in .loop as a clause, please?
Actually, I did this morning. So there.
Can you reiterate the question in case they didn't hear me? Or reiterate the one you were answering.
The question, Karen's question was, can I put my language that I created regarding exchange of keys in .loop as a clause? And I did this morning. It should be there. It should be the very last one. If it's not, let me know, because I did share it. So it should be in there. I'm going to go and check. Give me just a moment. Yeah, it says seller agrees to provide a set of keys to property at closing. Buyer acknowledges buyer must abide by Michigan's landlord-tenant laws regarding access to property during seller's possession after closing. It's really pretty simple. So now I can see that. So if anyone can't see that, please let me know, and we'll get our .loop experts to do it so it does show up. I think I did it, but if somebody please go and check and make sure that that it's showing up now. Okay. The other question we get a lot about is when a buyer shows up and they discover that the property isn't exactly as it was described in the seller's disclosure form. That's a whole different matter. Let's pretend, for example, that a seller did not disclose that the back half of their property was in wetlands, and the buyer intended, when they bought, to put in a pool. Well, if your property is in a wetlands area with a high water table, the likelihood that you're going to be able to put in a pool is going to be between slim and none. So, if you have a situation, and this disclosure issue can apply to a variety of things, whether it's wet basement, we've run into that a lot, roof leaks, all sorts of things. When there is a lack of disclosure on the part of the seller, lack of honest, forthright disclosure, it opens up legal possibilities, legal recourse for the buyer regarding damages. Now, every time I say words like legal recourse, I can assure you that costs money. And so to whatever extent you can, and sometimes it's impossible, it's best to try to get the two parties, the buyers and sellers, to figure out how they're going to resolve that difference without having to go to either small claims court or a higher court for a greater amount if the damage is severe. I like the idea of educating the sellers about what it entails to be a tenant. It is, thank you, Renee, it is really important. And I know that it doesn't take place. I know this conversation does not take place with the sellers, that they are no longer the owners of the property. In many cases, they think they still are, but they're not. The property became the buyer's property the day of closing, and that conversation needs to happen in order to avoid a lot of the situations that we run into. You've got to have that conversation with the seller and let them know that, well, as of right now, you are a renter in the buyer's home. And so I think that's a very important thing to remember. What happens when you take possession 30 days later and there's debris everywhere? They left, the washing machine out in the front yard, or, a pile of trash in the backyard, and debris all over the basement and everywhere. What do you do? Well, I know one of our agents picked up the phone and called a trash hauler and paid for it himself to make his client happy. But sometimes it's more extreme than that. I mean, it cost him several $100s. I'm not making light of it. But sometimes it's really, the damages can run really high very quickly when debris is left behind that somebody has to deal with, junk cars and so on and so forth. So it's always really, if there's any way you can get an escrow in those situations where buyers suspect that something's going to be left behind by a seller that's going to cost them a lot of money to get rid of, I would always encourage having some sort of an escrow set up, understanding, again, that in this market, sellers can say no to that offer and put that on the bottom of the pile. So, any other questions? How are we doing?
Let me check. I don't think there are.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any. So I hope that helps a little bit. There are, again, to reiterate, documents out there, short-term lease agreements, clauses that will help you clarify with both parties on the purchase agreement and beyond what the nature of the relationship is going to be if there is going to be possession after close. So, as always, thanks for joining, and I'll see you next week.